Hello, hello.
Hey, Gyongy, how are you doing?
I'm very good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. We got some people following us now. We have a little bit of an audience here that's interested in listening in on what we discuss, so it's exciting.
I know this is really amazing. Guys, thank you so much for supporting us, reaching out to us, encouraging us. This is lovely to see a little community building around our conversations. So, hopefully, we're gonna entertain you today and give you some really handy tips and ideas because our topic is actually building on the last one, which was about how you match your talent with your purpose. And now we take it to the next level and we want to explore how the combination of those two, what you're really good at and what you're passionate about, how that is going to be known by others. So, how do you come across at a job interview or in a job situation? And we're going to explore this magical word called personal branding. And because we have an expert among us about personal branding, you, Jissan, we thought we're gonna grill you a little bit today on this topic if you're up for it.
I'm always up for it. Yeah, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, right? So, yeah, excited to get into it.
Excellent. All right. So let me ask you a provocative question first, just to kind of as a warm up. So what is something that you believed about brand building when you were a full-time marketeer not so long ago that you now completely disagree with as a personal branding coach?
I don't know if I completely disagree with it because if I'm still in the world of, let's say, CPG branding and marketing, right? This whole idea of going viral. And, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but there's this idea that, all news or any news about you is good news. And at least you're in the vocabulary and you're in the conversation and you're trending, right? And for some brands, that's incredibly important. That gives them an opportunity to be able to be seen, be heard. And, I think a lot of brand marketers, they really try and sometimes stumble into something viral. I don't know if that's exactly the best thing for personal branding, right? It's like personal branding, you need to have a little bit more control over what you want to be seen as and, having outbursts and having kind of those moments in time in social media on a personal side may not be the best thing. That's how, some people get into trouble with going viral. But when you're talking about a non-human brand like, a cereal or, a medicine or something like that, and all of a sudden, you get the benefit of a celebrity using you or something that was unplanned. Sometimes it's exciting, right? But in the world of personal branding, there's a little bit more curating. You're
Mm-hmm.
in control. You're trying to be more deliberate about where you show up, how you show up. As opposed to in like traditional brand marketing, sometimes you let it go and you
Yeah.
hope you show up anywhere and anywhere is good, right? So I do think that there's probably a difference there.
Yeah. You know, where I always struggled with personal branding and where I had question marks myself around it was, where the brand and what it delivers were not really in line, right? And it seems to me that in the world of products or branding services, a little bit of exaggeration or quite a bit of exaggeration is kind of okay. Like, we got used to it, right? We all kind of discount it. Whereas when you brand yourself as a professional and it's completely, an obvious overstatement of the
Yeah.
truth, that becomes problematic, isn't it?
I do believe so, right? So with personal branding, and I think we get into this when I have younger clients who are, let's say, coming out of school and they're coming into the professional world, they're quite surprised that recruiters are looking at their LinkedIn, but also looking at their Facebook, looking at their Instagram, and really finding out what the full, footprint of you on social
Mhm.
media could be. And for some of us, we're very, very buttoned up. We're very professional. We have a lot of, control over how we show up online. But when you're younger in your career, social media is just a place to have fun. And there's sometimes this hard truth about now an interviewer or a recruiter is looking into my personal social media and they're getting some perspective of who you are, whether it's, what you've decided to put out there professionally or what you put out there socially, whether you want it to or not, sometimes it all comes into play when you're being evaluated as a talent in the workplace, right? So I
Mm,
do think that those of us that have had professional careers for a few years, you start to realize not everything can go on social media. And maybe I need to be a bit more careful about what images are out there, what, presence I have. But when you're early in your career, I think it's almost this sudden awakening that, oh my
mm,
gosh, my stuff from high school, my stuff from college is still out here. I should probably clean this up and things like that. And
mm.
I think in the world of recruitership in the future, the role of artificial intelligence is real. And I do
Yeah,
think that there's going to be less humans doing the early screening and evaluation, and there's going to be a lot more machine learning and these kind of AI models maybe doing the first pass at screening clients and candidates. And
yeah,
that aspect of personal branding is out there. Now, I think once you get into the professional side of it and you start to build your career, there is a little bit of, am I being overconfident? Am I being prideful by talking about everything? And I think that's a common mistake that people have. People assume that, well, I'm supposed to be a bit more reserved. I don't have to talk about everything I do, but there's a way you do it intelligently, and there's a way you can build it as part of your personal brand story that doesn't feel like bragging. Because like you said, sometimes it feels like maybe we're stroking our ego by talking about personal brand.
mm,
But it's really not. You're basically talking about authenticity and you're building
mm,
credibility and you're building kind of trust with people by sharing what you've done.
mm. Brilliant. So let's dive in. Give us a little bit of an overview why personal branding is important and what's the process. So let's start with the why.
Yeah, of course. When I've been in the corporate world and leading teams, there was always this conversation around getting promoted. And there
Hmm.
was always a frustration with people because while they were doing the projects, they were delivering everything on time as, the managers expected. For some reason, they were not being chosen for promotions. And
Hmm.
they felt like sometimes, well, I'm doing the same thing as the person that got promoted. Why didn't I? And what I help people understand is it's not so much what you do, but how you show up as well.
Hmm.
It's who knows you and, whether it's fair or not, it is a little bit about how strong your network is, how much other people speak about you, what your manager thinks about you, not just how you deliver, but not just what you deliver, but how you deliver it. So the conversations I started getting into with my individual team members was, well, if you feel like you're one of many, and you feel like you're not sticking out versus all of everyone else in the organization, let's work on your personal brand. And let's use this as a way to really stand out amongst others, not in an egotistical way, but in a very unique way, so that people know that what you bring to the table as an individual is different than everyone else. So that when it's time to build teams, when it's time to assign projects, you show up as one of the people, one of the, the short list of people that may potentially get that big project or that big opportunity to get promoted. So it really started with this place of, I had team members that felt like they weren't being seen. So then I said, okay, let's start working through personal branding. And it started with a very simple approach, right? Is if you do it well, you control your narrative. And the best way to think about this is there's always this idea of perception versus reality. So sometimes we all believe we are a certain way, we believe everyone sees us a certain way, but it's not until you start hearing feedback about yourself or you start talking to other people about, you ask them questions that you know the answers to, but you hear wildly different things. So you ask, what are my strengths? And what they play back to you are not the things you expected to be your strengths.
Mm,
Or even worse is you think you have a strength and they call that out as one of your weaknesses. That could be earth-shattering, right? Because it does take a hit to who you are, and there's a little bit of self-confidence and humility that comes from it. But when you have a good understanding of yourself, you have a good understanding of your personal brand. And it starts with that whole idea of what do people think about me? What's perception versus reality? And then once you know that, you can really start to take control of what you want your narrative to be. So, what I always tell people is this is your opportunity to be in the driver's seat of your career. It's your opportunity for you to be in control of how senior leaders see you, how your colleagues see you, how people depend on you. And then once you have that, understanding of self, it does help with credibility. It helps build trust. It helps you build, a bit more of a unique kind of identity within a company when there's 50,000 employees, 20,000 employees. You feel like you stand out amongst others and in a good way because you're in control of that. So I always start with helping people understand that this is a good thing, not a egotistical thing or a bad thing by any means.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And, in my work, I also come across situations when we talk about personal brand with my clients. And it often comes through when there is a damage on the personal brand.
Yeah.
You can't have a long, successful career, never making a mistake, never being fired, never missing a year. And any of those mistakes, make a mark on your brand, at least in within that environment I'm working with. So this saying that you're as good as your last results, and
That's right.
we've worked in the reality of a corporate environment. We know that you can have 20, 30 years of fantastic, successful track record, and you have one bad year, and then suddenly the earth starts shaking under you. So when I meet with those people whose personal brand got shaken a little bit because of some experience, we always do a good dive in and to understand that the personal brand is not their entire self. It's a narrative that has been created in certain circumstances with their influence or beyond their influence, and the separation from the entire self that kind of helps a little bit to create space between, to see that it's not them who is hurting, but it's the brand. So what's your view on that?
It's always interesting to have a track record of success because you're anticipating that there's only a matter of time before you have that stumbling block. And I
Mm,
think for all of us, we should expect it. If you haven't had it yet, it's probably coming. And if you've lived through it, it feels like hell when you go through it.
yeah.
But the moment you come on the other side, the year flips over, you have a better year, all of a sudden it becomes one of your best lessons learned and it becomes a motivational story for your teams. It becomes an example of here's a challenge that I faced in the past. I was able to overcome it, right? So the thing that I always tell my team is why it's so important to go back and tell a clear story about your work history is because you need people to understand that when that mistake happens or when you have that bad year, it's a blip in the radar of your entire career, which has been a strong record of success. If no one knows what you've been doing in the past, then what you've done recently is the only reality they have of you, which makes it really hard and frustrating because the individual will know, well, I've had 10 years of success and now all of a sudden I'm being judged on the last 12 months. But the reality is if you've never told anyone about the last 9 years and you've never made it a deliberate attempt to remind people of your previous successes, they won't remember it. And it's not fair for you to assume that they have to remember that. They will only remember what's in front of them.
Yeah.
So a lot of times with my clients, what I tell them is when they're facing a challenge to reference when they've achieved something similar in the past. So sometimes when you're talking to your manager, you're facing a challenge, you remind them, a couple of years ago, I had a similar issue. Here's how I approached it. I'm going to take the same approach here. And by just framing that conversation, it gives the audience a bit of credibility and trust in you to know that you've done this before. If you can give them the answer and never have the context of why you believe this is a strong answer, and they'll just say he's guessing or he's
Mm,
hoping it'll get better. But when you talk
mm,
about how this is the third time you've faced a challenge like this and you've delivered through it in the previous times. It gives people much more confidence. And then also, if you do fail, they also understand and remember that this is the one example of when it didn't go well, but you've had previous examples. Now, if you have multiple years of not performing, over and over and over again, it gets a little hard to just go back to the past and just say that it's, look at my previous record if the most recent success hasn't been there. So, you always have a little bit of room to make a mistake and to recover. But I think it's always important to remember that it's never going to be as bad as the time that you're living through it. The moment you get through it, it will become one of those lessons learned, and then it becomes a source of strength because, when you're motivating teams and you're helping people, especially, people that are younger or junior to you, if they're seeing the issue for the first time, they want to hear that their leader has experienced this before or has lived through these challenges before, right?
Mhm.
So we've all had a bad financial quarter, or we've had a bad financial year where sales did not deliver. For someone that's young in their career, this might be the first time they're going through it, and it feels very scary. It feels very worrisome. But for them to have a leader that said, you know what, I've lived through these, there's going to be good years and bad years. There's going to be times where we go through this, and then maintaining that culture, it's very powerful. So
Yeah,
these
I
lessons
agree.
learned, become incredibly valuable as your part of your personal brand.
Absolutely, I agree. So let's dive into the process of creating a
Yeah.
personal brand. So could you walk us through how you start?
Yeah, so at Diversify, one of the things that we do with all of our clients is we follow a pretty standard approach, right? So the first thing that we do is always a strength assessment. So there's a lot of tools out there. I personally like Strength Finders, which is a wonderful book by Gallup. And what they do is they essentially ask you a series of questions and it identifies what your natural strengths are. Once you do that, you really have a good understanding of where regardless of the role you sit in, whether it's finance, marketing, supply chain, HR, there's some natural strengths that you just possess and that you want to show up with. So we identify what those are. And what we do is we think about how to double and triple down on those. So I'm really from the camp of we all have development gaps. We all have opportunities to kind of improve weakness areas. But I believe that when you try to improve those, there's only a marginal amount of improvement you're going to get there. But if you
Hmm.
take one of your natural strengths and you try to go from good to great to exemplary, I do believe it's much easier because you have a natural strength already. You have a tendency to want to get better in something you're really good at, and you'll probably go up, in a very big exponential growth pattern if you double down on your strengths, right?
Hmm.
So by first understanding what your strengths are, and then what we do is we go through this feedback collection process. So we identify 4 to 5 stakeholders and we walk around and ask them very honest questions about ourselves. What do you believe are my strengths? What do you believe are my weaknesses? What's my leadership approach? When do I show up best? When do I show up, kind of in my worst? And what are those circumstances? And the reason why we're asking those questions is that sometimes hopefully you hear exactly what you expect, but very rarely do we. So this is really that humility, that opportunity for people to say, wow, okay, so I expected them to say something and they said something completely different. Whether you agree to it or not, I always tell my clients, it doesn't matter if you agree or not. It's what they believe. And a big part of controlling your personal brand is just knowing what people think about you. Now, if it's something that you don't like and it's something you don't agree with, then you have very clear, plans now on how you're going to address that and how you're going to show up
Hmm.
differently because there's something you're doing today about it, right? So we assess the strengths, we then get into that kind of feedback process. Once we understand that, then what we do is we go back and we start doing something called a unique value proposition. This is basically a fancy way that brands in marketing they talk about what is that one thing that you want to be known for within the marketplace. So if you have all of these unique strengths, we start to overlap what were your life lessons? What were
Hmm.
your lived experiences, right? So, when you were young, did you travel a lot as a family? Did you have to move and therefore you had to prove yourself to be adaptable very early in your life? What were your challenges when you had your first career, your second career? What are all of those things that make you incredibly dynamic? And then we start to say, okay, based on those lived experiences and the strengths that we've assessed you on, here's what I want to stand for. So then we literally work on a purpose statement. So, everyone has like an individual statement that represents their brand. And then once we understand that, then we start telling stories. So, what are the stories that are going to help people communicate your brand? So if your brand, so, one of the things to think about is if your brand is very much built on this whole idea that I turn around businesses and you give me something that's in a bad position and I get it to a better position, then we better have three or four stories and examples of when you've done that in the past. Because if you want to be known for that, people need to believe based on your stories that you've done it before. So we start to be very deliberate about these stories. And then once we develop these stories, then it's about knowing when to land the stories in the workplace. So think about icebreakers. Think about when you're in charge of a new team for the first time and you have that first meeting where you're introducing yourself to your team. Now we're very deliberate about what we choose to share in those
Mhm,
forums. And we use also that opportunity to start asking for projects. So now that you understand yourself, you understand your story, now we go to our managers, we go to our business leaders, and we start to ask for certain experiences. We ask for turnaround opportunities because we want to demonstrate it. We ask for specific projects because we want to demonstrate our strengths.
mhm,
So if we follow this approach, what you find is that you're now very much in control of not only the work that you're assigned, but also the choices that you're given in your career.
mhm,
If you don't do this, then what typically happens is you're at the mercy of your manager and you're at the mercy of your strategy from two leaders above you on what you're going to be doing. So you're basically handed down projects, you're handed down opportunities, and there's not a lot of conversation around whether or not this is the right thing for you, whether or not this is the kind of role you're looking for. So when we go through that process, to be quite honest, Gyongy, people have a much better understanding of self and that leads them to having much more clear conversations with their manager around development objectives, very clear ideas of what kind of projects they're looking for. Also, when it's time to choose what's your next move in your career, you have much more clarity to why one role is better than the other because you have that understanding of yourself as well.
Yeah, wonderful. So the word you used the most in this part of our conversation was choice and choose.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
what I'm hearing is that creating a personal brand is a choiceful storytelling. You put a lot of stories in to creating that brand. You put the personal storytelling through an assessment like the Gallup, the Strengths Finder, personal storytelling through, explaining what happened in your career. And then you kind of distilling it. And what comes out at the end is your choices that this is how you're going to talk about yourself. This is how you're shaping the story with the purpose of achieving your goal. And yeah.
That's exactly right, Junji. Because if you think about traditional consumer packaged goods and brand marketing, it's the same thing. So a
Mhm,
brand for a household product might go in many different directions. So you basically
mhm,
start with, you hire a bunch of agencies, you bring them in, you identify a bunch of whiteboard opportunities, a bunch of white
mhm,
space. The brand can represent this, it can talk to these consumers. But at the end of the day, you got to make choices because just like the mental capacity of someone to understand who you are, consumers are the same thing. You can't be everything to everybody. So a brand has to make those choices around, I'm going to be focused on this consumer segment. I'm going to be known for this. I'm going to differentiate myself from my competitors on the shelf because I have a unique packaging or I have a unique way of delivering my product to them. I have a
mhm,
unique marketing voice, right? So
mhm,
these are all choices that we do in traditional brand marketing. So with personal branding, it's the same thing. You're basically taking an entire inventory of your life and you're basically pinpointing what choices do you want to be known for and what choices do you want to communicate first. Because if
mhm,
you give someone the opportunity, you can probably speak for 5 days about everything in your life. They're going to tune out after a couple of hours, right? And even
mhm,
then, like probably after 15 minutes, to quite honest. So you having this inventory of stories means that you can
mhm.
prioritize. If I can only share one thing about myself, I know exactly what I would share. Or if I have the opportunity to share three things to my team, here's the top three things I will definitely be sharing.
Fantastic. There is one more thing that is bugging you since we started this conversation, and I meant to ask you this before we move on to our next question. And this is about cultural differences. So you're American, I'm European. You worked in Europe, so you
Yeah.
noticed, I'm sure, the differences. From the world of brand building, I also remember business meetings when we were debating whether a toothpaste could taste cinnamon anywhere in the world. And I remember the conversation about how cultural differences play into taste and everything. So let's talk a little bit about taste around
Mhm.
personal brand. What's your experience on that? What's your view, and how do you advise your clients? Because, let's be mindful that we have a nicely growing global audience here on this
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah, of course. So this is where, stereotypes and all those things have to be played out as well, right? So let me give you an
Mm-hmm,
example. When I was going to Vietnam as well as to Poland, when I walked in, before anyone knew who I was, they knew I was American. And one
mm-hmm,
of the things I realized was there was a lot of assumptions being made about my style, my personality, how
mm-hmm,
I'm going to be in meetings because the American is here, right?
mm-hmm,
And they assumed it would be a bit more directive, a bit more loud, a bit more extrovert. But I think what you have to do is have the self-humility and self-awareness to say, what is my personal brand? Because you have to be authentic. But
mm-hmm,
how should I deliver my personal brand is very
mm-hmm.
circumstantial. And it's very much
Ooh,
based on the audience you're looking at,
yeah.
right? So in Vietnam, for example, I knew that the perception was that I was the loudest, or I'm going to be the big American that's going to be very directive and tell people what to do and lead. So what I did was I was deliberately more quiet to allow space for others to have conversations, to bring forward ideas. And there was also this, I almost admitted up front that I do not have the answers because I'm not from this culture. So I'm looking to learn first.
Mm-hmm,
So, my personal brand is still going to be the same because once I have a very good understanding of what's going on, it's going to come forward. And I think in Europe as well, when we were together in Poland, the team that I was leading was from all over Central and Eastern Europe. There were Hungarians, there were people from Czech and Poland, and I'm from America. I haven't had a chance to work in these regions, so I had to listen and think about where could I add value and where could I learn? Because,
mm-hmm,
part of my personal brand has to be the fact that I can adapt and I can be a part of a situation that's, almost like, a bit changing, right?
mm-hmm,
So I think you have to have the self-humility, you have to have the self-awareness to be able to sit there and say, I'm not going to speak for a little while. I'm going to listen and I'm going to build
mm-hmm,
trust. And then what I did was I found out who my stakeholders were. So who are these leaders? Who are the people that I'm working with? And how can I help them before they try to help me? So I went out of my way to say, well, in the US, I've learned these things, so maybe I can bring that to them. So I would meet with people individually and say, you're working on a project, I've had some experience in this space. Have you considered this and that? And I wouldn't do it in public forums. So I was
mm-hmm,
very deliberate about not being the person in the big conference room saying, I've had that experience. Why don't you try
mm-hmm,
this? Instead, I would wait for the meeting to finish, follow up with them separately,
mm-hmm.
and in a one-on-one conversation share that I have ideas, because in some of those other environments, it's not good when you are in a big conference room saying there's a better way to do it, right? It humiliates the person potentially, and it also reinforces maybe some of the stereotypes of what
Yeah.
the American in the room would do. So I was very deliberate about trying to adhere to that, but I wouldn't stay back from sharing my opinion. I would just do it in a better way, I think.
Yeah.
Does that
So,
make
so what
sense?
I'm Yeah, absolutely. What I'm hearing is it's actually very powerful that you recommend staying true to your one's personal brand, but adjust the delivery to the
That's exactly it.
circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the style, right? And I
Mm.
think
Yeah.
you need to feel comfortable that your style has to adapt to the audience, but it's still who you are, and you're still going to deliver the same type of way that you would, but you just need to be smart about what's the forum and when do you bring in your personal brand.
Yeah. Fantastic. So I have one more question, potentially again a little bit provocative. So imagine you had this amazing career. Many of my clients have a fantastic track record of success, and they've been treated as talents for over many, many years, and something happens, and then the brand needs to be looked at. So,
Yeah.
this rebranding as a topic, how would you go about it? And first of all, I want to ask a personal experience. So, have you ever had to rebrand yourself? And you can, if you're brave, share us real life stories like, party, dating, potentially work as well. But have you ever had to rebrand yourself? Or have you
You know,
ever decided, yeah?
yeah, I think, very early on, there's this cultural rebranding that I had to do, right? So my parents are
Mm-hmm.
from India. They were
Mm-hmm.
firstborn generation American. So I always had this culture identity where at
Mm-hmm.
home and at church and, places where it was basically the Indian community, we were still very much in traditional manners and cultural norms and things like that that were very different than American culture.
Mm-hmm.
But when I go to
Mm-hmm.
school and I'm with my friends, I'm very much an American, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
found myself kind of switching between these two worlds all the time when I was a child. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a bit confusing, right? Because am I Indian? Am I
Mm-hmm.
American?
Mm-hmm.
I believe I'm more American than Indian in the sense that, I lived in and I've been born and I've been raised and I've gone to school in the American culture. But that was always a bit of a personal branding, rebranding. And I think a lot of firstborn generation Indians in America would say the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
where it was very dynamic and it was almost two worlds colliding all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Because the traditional Indian traditions and heritage and stuff like that is a little different than what Americans are,
Mm-hmm.
right? And our parents only knew one version of the truth. They knew the Indian conservative heritage, and they were,
Mm-hmm.
living in America, but they were trying to hold on to these roots, and we're trying to build new roots as kids. So, that was always an interesting one. I think professionally, though, the biggest rebranding I had is when I moved from, kind of a technology background to marketing. So
Mm-hmm.
my first couple of years, I was at Microsoft, had a wonderful time working there, built this, really strong technical background. Then I went to Deloitte Consulting. I did more technology, but in the consulting space. And then when I went and got my MBA, I got it in marketing, and I got my first role at, GSK, where we all started coming together. That was when I started marketing and brand management.
Mm-hmm.
I went out of my way to never talk about technology and technical aspects because I was afraid that if I brought up those things, I would be seen as not a marketer. So I had this
Mm-hmm.
imposter syndrome that I had to only be a marketer. I had to pretend and forget everything that was there before. And I would use the skills that I knew that I was good at, but for the most part, I would basically try to rebrand myself as this pure
Mm-hmm.
marketer. Well, what ended up happening is that we just become a blend of ourselves because as the marketing function grew, over the next 10 years, digital marketing and technology became intertwined with marketing. And now all of a sudden, my technical background that I was hiding for all these years was actually the biggest point of differentiation, is that I understood the technical aspects much more
Mm-hmm.
than I had experience with the marketing. And it was the side that I was trying to hide for years. So I think rebranding is a normal thing. What we'll find out is that rebranding is never a one side or the other. It's basically adding on new experiences, new lived experiences, but you're never losing who you are originally. I think you're just choosing which story to tell, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
again, going back to the prioritization of all the things you
Yeah.
could be, your personal brand rebranding just means that you're choosing to tell different stories now, but it doesn't mean those lived experiences went away or your previous experiences or jobs went away. It's just that that's not going to be the first story you tell anymore. You're going to tell a
Yeah.
different story now. So that's the
Is
way I
it
would tell people my
similar?
person.
Is it similar in brand building?
I think in brand building, there's a little bit more of staying core to who you are,
Mm-hmm.
unless the market is changing dynamically, right? So
Mm-hmm.
usually what happens is in CPG marketing and consumer packaged goods, you usually have this new dynamic competitor, whether it's from TikTok or something that completely breaks the rules, changes the game. And if you're the traditional market leader, you have to kind of start to move into that space and become a little bit more like the competitors. But what we always remember is that your heritage is your heritage, and consumers are still going to remember who you were first. So you can't
Mm-hmm.
completely change everything you are, but it is possible. It's just hard to do.
Mm,
So a lot of marketers struggle with that idea of how much do I change versus how much do I hold on to what consumers remember about who I am.
yeah, fantastic. Well, that's a fascinating topic. Shall we give a homework around this to our
Yeah, of course.
listeners?
Yeah, and I think because we have such a wide group of, audience members and stuff like that, I think the homework is simple today. Which camp do you fall into? Are you the ones that are developing your personal brand for the first time? And usually this means either you have not spent time thinking about this, therefore you're building it from scratch now, or maybe you're early in your career and you only have a couple of experiences under your belt. But, if you're starting off on your personal brand journey, start to think through the things we talked about. What are your strengths? Who are the people you trust to go get feedback? And start to develop those initial stories of what you want to be known for. Because, when you start having one-on-ones with your managers, we're coming up on mid-year conversations soon in a couple of months here, in terms of performance and conversations. It's good for you to remind people who you are and where you came from. Now, if you're on the other side of the camp where you do have a very strong understanding of who you are, you have a track record of success, and you do have a personal brand out there, I would say, how old or how fresh is that brand? So, do you need to rebrand? Are you at a crossroads in your career where something may come up that allows you to reconsider or reevaluate your brand? Maybe you're thinking about a career switch. And if that's the case, I think, there's a different approach there where you still take assessment of your strengths, but you start to be very choiceful about what stories are relevant for your rebranding. So
Mm,
I think that's it, right? Is the homework is, find out if you're in the beginning of your journey or you're somewhere in the middle of your journey. And are you creating your personal brand or are you nurturing and building, or rebranding potentially?
brilliant. So, thanks so much, guys. Drop us a line if you have any comments, feedback, or you want to share your story. We are always very keen to hear from you. And thanks so much, Jissan. That was great talking to you. I learned a lot about personal brands. So, see you at the
Yeah.
next conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Gyongy. And if anyone has questions, obviously reach out to us on LinkedIn. We're happy to have individual conversations with anyone if it's around personal branding or coaching. So yeah, thank you,
And
Gyongy.
guys will find your details in the meeting in the podcast notes, right?
That's right.
Excellent. All right. Take care. Thank you.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.
Bye-bye.